Many schools closed their doors in March as COVID-19 swept around the globe. The 6 months since have posed unprecedented challenges. For students suddenly cut off from classmates and thrown into remote learning, teachers navigating new technology, and parents burdened with extra responsibilities. Some schools have chosen to keep holding their classes online. Other students and teachers are making a joyous return to their classrooms as a new school year begins.
I'm happy that the school has started because I haven't seen my friend and my teacher for a long time. We've been locked in our houses and I forgot how the normal schooling looks. To reopen the schools is of fundamental importance. There's nothing that can substitute schools. From our point of view, this is a huge joy, to reopen our gates to our 1,200 pupils.
But the reopening is also a major safety concern. How to bring millions of children and teachers back into schools while keeping them safe from the virus. As some schools struggle to reopen to make up for lost time, others remain completely empty. The picture varies greatly between countries, as our correspondents around the world can explain.
Here in Uganda's capital, Kampala, schools remain closed. What you see here is a reflection of what's happening across the country, right from elementary level to university level. Classes remain closed. The government is not sure of when it will reopen schools now, especially with the rising cases of COVID-19. Now, many teachers have already lost their jobs. Earlier on, the government tried to introduce lessons on radio and television, but sustaining that became a challenge. So many families have already described 2020 as a lost academic year.
Students are back in school throughout the whole of China, including Wuhan, where the epidemic has started. Students need to wear masks, there are social distancing measures and staggered schedules, but otherwise schools are supposed to go back to their normal curriculum.
Here in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, the COVID-19 pandemic is not the only crisis that faces the educational system. Right behind me is an exhibit of a school out of 160 that were totally destroyed or damaged due to the colossal Beirut port explosion, while the school year is only a few days away. The destruction that was caused by the shockwaves of the explosion aggravated the calamity on residents already suffering from an unprecedented economic crisis.
The German government is ruling out a second lockdown, confident that the current testing, tracing and tracking capacities will be enough to contain the current levels of corona outbreaks. In the absence of a tangible health crisis and with the economy recovering faster than expected, there's now an all-out debate here in Germany over whether the government wasn't too cautious in the first place. A loud minority has been taking to the streets over this. Nationwide, schools remain open, but when it comes to the question which conditions like masks apply, that's still regional patchwork.
In March, the Kenyan government closed schools and colleges nationwide, a sudden measure that affected 17 million learners across the country, including among tribal communities, as DW's Idris Mukhtar reports.
2020 was the beginning of an exciting new chapter for Vincent Tulito High School. But in mid-March, in response to COVID-19, the Kenyan government closed all schools, including higher education. The measure disrupted the lives of nearly 17 million students across the country. For 16-year-old Tulito, it's meant herding his family cattle out in the wild rather than pursuing an education.
I was really excited to join high school because I've never been to boarding school. But I was frustrated when I was told schools would be closed. Now I miss the interaction with other students and sharing ideas.
Long-distance learning comes with other challenges. Tulito simply doesn't have enough time for studying.
Now it's just wake up, look after cattle, prepare a fence, and you can't concentrate when you try to study. You fall asleep.
On a day like this classroom would be abuzz with students, 40 or even more, until the Kenyan government cancelled the 2020 academic year due to the coronavirus. But for this Maasai community, one qualified teacher is all that they have. 22-year-old Danny Masari usually teaches near the Tanzanian border, but now he has taken to volunteering in his home village.
Wanajua walimu. In a community like this, they know so and so is a teacher, and we have to help the kids. Otherwise, the kids will miss a lot from classroom.
But experts believe there's a lot of work to be done before schools can safely reopen in Kenya.
I think the first point would really be training for our teachers. Once we've done the training, then we need to look at our infrastructure. For example, if our building was able to accommodate a group of 20 girls, how can we use it now to accommodate less girls to enable us to do social distancing?
For now, schools remain closed for the foreseeable future. But it's yet another day of herding cattle for Tulito, counting down the days until he's able to resume his dream of an education that perhaps over time could change his life.
Well, let's speak to David Evans, who's an economist with the Centre for Global Development. David, are these closures likely to have lasting effects for countries like Kenya?
These are likely to have enormous implications for these students' lives and for the country as a whole. These kids aren't learning. A lot of them have parents who've lost work, so the students are working. And the longer they're out of school, the less likely they are to go back to school once they reopen. Adolescents especially will be working and they'll ask, why do I have to go back to school? And what's worse, during the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, another example of a long-term school closures led to a sharp increase in adolescent pregnancy. So these can really be devastating to students.
Yeah, this is something we've talked about earlier this week on the programme, that limiting the amount of encounters that children and young people have with the authorities can cause all sorts of problems. We've talked about Africa there, but globally, children are missing out on education all over the world.
It's absolutely true. At the height of the epidemic, more than 1.5 billion students around the world were out of school. It's an unimaginable number. And even though some are coming back now, there are many that still remain out. A lot of kids don't have access to good information technology. In low and middle income countries, fewer than a quarter of homes have access to the internet. And so imagining delivering effective online learning, effective distance learning is just impossible. And the kids who lack access the most, of course, are the most vulnerable kids in the first place.
So should countries be rushing to reopen schools, even though there is always that risk that children are going to go home and they're going to give coronavirus to an older, more vulnerable person?
Countries need to keep children and teachers safe, but primary school children are the least able to learn remotely, and so getting them back to school safely needs to be the highest priority. And furthermore, what countries like Kenya and others need to do is, when these students come back, invest in special efforts to make sure the most vulnerable kids make it back to the classroom and are able to have a catch-up so they can get back on track, so that they aren't starting a whole year behind.
Have you seen any approaches around the world to the reopening of schools that you've thought, yes, they're getting that right?
So relatively few countries, especially in low and middle income countries, are really doing this, and so it's still an open game. But we do see that some countries are, making sure that kids are in school at least for a couple of days, so that you can reduce the capacity in a classroom, so you can have half as many kids in the classroom on a given day, so you can have social distancing and keep those kids separate, but at least have 2.5 days of face-to-face instruction with the teacher.
David Evans from the Centre for Global Development, thank you so much for bringing us up to date.
Thank you.
And now it's time for your questions to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
Does COVID-19 transmission change depending on whether it's humid or if it's hot and dry?
One of the great hopes last winter here in the Northern Hemisphere, back in February and March, that COVID-19 would prove to be seasonal, hasn't really panned out. And in the last months, a lot of researchers have come out with often conflicting messages about when and how environmental factors are influencing the spread of the disease. Any direct links between outdoor temperatures and transmission of the virus seem to still be pretty tenuous to me. But increasingly, researchers are coming to a more united conclusion that humidity, the amount of moisture in the air, could be playing a pretty big role in the spread of SARS-CoV-2, both indoors and out. The evidence is mounting that dry air makes the virus spread more rapidly. One new study out of Australia claims that when relative humidity falls just 1%, COVID-19 cases could rise by 7 to 8%. The explanation on offer is this. Moister air causes the aerosols and droplets that an infected person coughs out to grow larger as they absorb water vapor, which makes them sink to the ground faster. But when the air is dry, the opposite happens. Then the virus-containing droplets shrink as their moisture is absorbed by the surrounding air. That makes them lighter and more likely to drift around at head level and be inhaled by someone else. Another factor that could well be playing a role when the air is dry is that it also dries out your nasal passages. And they're your first line of defense against airborne pathogens like SARS-CoV-2. When they dry up, it also makes it easier for those pathogens to gain a foothold.